tell me who really drove the initial plan to save the camp back in the 1980s when the Y was planning to close it?
Well, there's no doubt about that. There were 10 of us, but Steve Ambler was the person that had the vision. He pulled 10 people together. We were all members of the Rotary Club, and none of us, or maybe only one or two, had any real experience with summer camps, but we did want to see the camp continue.
Okay, and why? Like, it's all well and good to see it continue, but why? What was the attachment to Camp Kawartha?
Well, I think two or three things. One is Rotary had been involved in this camp from 1921 on. They were the originators of it. Even in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, Rotary built the director's cabin over here. They built the dining room, and they contribute to camp sponsorships on an ongoing basis. So there was a long history of that. The other thing is there was a fear that if the property was sold, one of two things would happen. Developers would make it into a luxury cottage community, or people with deep pockets, probably from Toronto, would buy and upgrade the facilities, resulting in it being priced out of the reach of the people that Rotary tries to help and that had always come here.
Did you know much about the camp yourself back then?
I knew a little bit. As I said, all 10 of us were members of the Rotary Club. The Rotary Club had a surf and turf out here for quite a few years. We built the odd building, and of course Camp Kawartha had a great reputation in the community. So I knew a little bit. I knew very little about camping though.
Right. And who among that group, who took on which roles? What were the primary roles that you felt you guys needed to fill?
Oh, my memory has to be used here. Steve Ambler had the vision. He was an industrialist, a business person in town, so he had a lot of connections with contractors. So he brought in a lot of freebies that way. Jack Roger was a life insurance salesman and a born salesman, so he was the fundraiser. I ended up being the property superintendent or manager, and I was able to get a lot of volunteers to help us. And you know, there were some on the board who were older than the rest of us, but as some people say, the old money from around town. So we had, you know, some of the really influential families and well-known people from the community.
Okay, so there was lots of roles to fill. And what do you remember most about that period? I mean, it was a fairly, you know, contentious period. The Y was getting rid of the camp. You guys were stepping in. What was the sort of the temperature around? Were you guys nervous? Were you guys excited? Were you what was going on?
All of the above, I would say.
Okay.
We obviously were nervous. It was a big business adventure, and most of us were well known in the community, and to a degree we were putting our personal reputations on the line, and we certainly didn't want to be connected to a flock.
Right.
The other thing was we also realized that we really didn't know much about camping. We realized that for whatever reason the camp had not succeeded in the recent past, and we had to come up with a business plan that, well, met our needs and the times, but we had to be sure that it was a viable alternative.
Right. And was the focus on resurrecting the summer camp, or was it on, resurrecting the summer camp and including year-round activities? What was the thinking there?
Well, I think at the start it was 100%, making a summer camp live into the future. At that time there were some, but not a lot, of summer camps that offered outdoor education and winter programs. When we did it, today you'd be doing it to save the planet. those days we were doing it to save ourselves. We realized that the most important thing we could get, and I think what was missing when the Y had it, was a year-round director and some year-round staff, like maintenance and kitchen staff. And the only way to be able to afford that would be to have operations that lasted through the year. So
Right.
when we did it, it was really to keep good staff here year-round, as opposed to saving the planet or doing anything that was desperately needed in the community.
Right. Okay. Okay. Summer camp hadn't happened for a few years at that point. When the Y closed it down, I think it was in 82. You guys stepped in 83, 84 and purchased the camp. How did you get it started up again? What was the sort of, I guess, the marketing plan to let everyone know that Camp Kawartha was back?
Well, first of all, we had to refurbish the place. It had not been maintained as well as it should have for several years, and then was sitting here idle for 2 or 3. So that was one part of the equation. We did not get, as I recall, any what you call customer list. So we didn't have a list of previous campers. So we had to rely entirely on our own advertising and spreading the word in the community that we were here and ready to go again. So there was a big marketing plan, and of course we had no staff came with the purchase. So every staff member was new to the camp, and that was the challenge.
Right. Who was your director that first year back?
Well, Sandra Raymond was our first director. Sandra had a real challenge. She had some background in the food service business, and realized that we couldn't have the top equipment, we couldn't have everything that we really wanted, but we did want to have a really good kitchen. If kids are well fed and like their cooks, that makes for a good summer camp, and that was one thing that we focused on that first year.
Right, right. Do you have any anecdotes or stories about unusual things that happened, or funny things that might have happened, or funny characters that you encountered through that time?
Well, Jack Frost was our first property manager, maintenance supervisor. I don't even remember what we called him, but he was the jack of all trades. His name was, I think his initials were NG, but everybody called him Jack Frost, and the vast majority of people did not know what his real name was, and I'm not sure that I ever did. But he was a real character. He smoked a pipe. In those days it was socially acceptable. He had sometimes on politically incorrect phraseology, but the camp meant everything to him. He lived only a kilometer or so down the road here, and he was a godsend to those early days at the camp.
Okay.
The other thing, if you want me to tell another story, when we bought the camp, there was hardly any washroom facilities. Showers were outside. There's 4 small toilets, and 2 of them have sinks in the back of the dining hall. But there was no other comfort station, as the term is nowadays. So, and there's no septic system. So the effluent from the toilets and the sinks and the kitchen went into a tank, holding tank. It was only big enough to do that for 2 days. So every second day, the septic tanker, honey wagon some people call them, had to come in and down the steep hill in front of the dining hall over here to the lower level to pump out the tank. I wasn't here, so I can't be blamed, but one day at the top of that steep hill, he had a complete brake failure on the truck. Now, the truck probably was empty, but a heavy truck going down a steep hill gained speed pretty quickly. And at the bottom of the hill, there was nothing but open playground for a couple of 200 or 300 feet, and then the lake. All he could do, and what he did was he just drove purposely into a big tree to stop. And I can't say, and now you know the rest of the story, because I don't know the rest of the story. But obviously he would have to be towed out of here and get his brakes fixed. But with all the kids around and so on, that not only is maybe humorous, but it certainly had a big element of danger.
Yeah.
That fall we put in the septic bed that we're actually sitting on this minute, and that was our biggest expense that first year, $35,000. And it's done us for, what's that now, 30 some years.
How big an effort was put into fundraising?
Well, obviously that was important. At that time there were some government grants, so I don't remember the figure now, but most of what we did that first summer was donated. Labor was virtually all donated, and a lot of supplies and equipment and materials that we bought, we got really good deals on. And so our actual out-of-pocket expense was pretty much covered, as I recall, by a government grant. So fundraising was a huge challenge. We sold memberships, so that the 10 of us who stuck our heads out, we each put in $500, which today I suppose would be $1,000. And we sold memberships to quite a few people. When we had an annual meeting, nobody came because they didn't want to get stuck with what we were having to do. But that's how we sort of identified the real supporters of the camp.
Right. Do you have any memories of your fellow 1985ers? What sort of characters were there?
Well, the one thing that came to light, and I think you maybe brought it to a head, unfortunately we did never get an official photograph or portrait, not even snapshot of the 10 of us together. We were so committed to making this thing work, and had so much work to do, that every minute that we could swing to help the camp, it was the end of a hammer or a paintbrush,
Yep.
not patting ourselves in the back with a photograph.
Yeah.
The characters on the board, well, we had all been in Rotary together for several years, so we knew each other fairly well. I would like to have sat down with Steve Ambler and said, why did you pick the 10 that you did? Because I think it was sort of a hand-picked. Like, I was the secretary of the Rotary Club, and I knew nothing about this coming together until after the Rotary Club voted to let the camp go and not to make a fuss over it. I was secretary of the club. I think maybe he thought I'd be the secretary of the group, and that would have been a lot easier than re-roofing and all the maintenance work around here.
You were here a lot, eh?
Yeah. I was here, I think it was, I read it this morning, got it in my file, 65 or 70 times, 85 times I think that first, over about 8 months. So
Yeah.
many days, many evenings, every Saturday and Sunday for most of the summer.
Yeah.
But you can always sleep afterwards, and when you're doing something that you really believe in, it doesn't seem like a lot of work.
Yeah.
And we got along great.
Yeah.
On an average Saturday, well, not an average, but many Saturdays, there would be 12 to 15 trucks and cars parked over here, all of them volunteers that were out and about someplace on these 11 acres fixing up buildings. And I was running around just seeing who was doing what and what materials I need to get bought. And I was tired at the end of the day. I probably didn't hit too many nails on the head with a hammer, but I kept an eye on everything and kept everybody up happy and kept equipment coming.
Now, you know, we hear the kids in the background here, you know, they're yelling at each other and they've just finished lunch and, you know, that sort of thing. What are your feelings when you see that or hear that, knowing that you were one of the 10 who was instrumental, absolutely vital in making this continue? What sort of thoughts does that evoke for you?
Yes, and I've got a couple of trains of thought there, and they're not new. This has happened many times. In those early days, I would often be out here. It was just like today, nice day of listening to voices and stuff. And I said to myself, if the 10 of us had not done what we did, there are 20, 30, 40, at one time maybe 50, 60 staff that are here for the summer with a summer job, making money, and counselors that are learning skills, and all of them helping to develop their own resume, if you want to be crass about it, but developing their own skills and so on. And that would not have been, may not have happened. The other story I like to think about, and it really struck me at the time. Sometimes I tear up when I think about it. It was a nice day like this. I knew it was the end of the camp session. So everybody that was a camper here was going home at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and the staff then would have 24 hours, whatever, sort of to themselves. So, and I was working way in the background someplace, and they come out onto the field here, and I said, oh, there's still quite a few people around. And then I noticed, over here there was 2 parents and a couple of kids, and over here 1 parent and a camper or 2. Over there was another camper grabbing their parents by the hand and heading down to the cabin. They were all campers that could have gone home. And my interpretation was that they were so much in love, had such a great time when they were here. They really did not want to leave, and they just had to. If they could only sit in the grass for an extra 5 or 10 minutes, they'd be happy. And if they could take their parents to show them their cabin and the other things they did, to me that made it all worthwhile.
Beautiful. Okay, that's great. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're here with Rudy Massimo on July 26, 2022. Rudy is the former executive director of Camp Kawartha. Okay, Rudy, which years were you here at Camp Kawartha?
I knew you were going to ask that. I think it was 1988 to 1998.
Okay. Who was your predecessor, do you know?
Before that, Sandra Raymond.
Sandra Raymond, okay. All right.
Sandra Raymond served for 2 years, I believe, is when the camp was repurchased by a group of Rotarians. 10 Rotarians came together and incorporated Camp Kawartha Incorporated. And the first executive director was Sandra Raymond. I believe she was here for 2 years, maybe 3, and I replaced her in '88.
Okay. Back then, were you were the executive director, but were you also the summer camp director?
Correct. Back then the model was slightly different, or the structure was slightly different. So we lived on site for the full 10 years. So we were here 365 days of the year, with the exceptions of our frequent or infrequent holidays. We were here, we lived on site, and I was involved with both the summer camp and the outdoor ed program. And then our kids got to enjoy the property with us when we lived here on site in the little small cabin by the office.
When you were summer camp director, when you had that hat on, how many campers would there have been here through a summer camp season?
I'm going to guess our top number would have been 144, if I recall. Those are the numbers I played with back then. About 144, including the LIT program and our out trip programs.
Okay. And how many staff would you be supervising?
There were a lot less staff back then, and I think people just did multiple jobs back then. So I'm going to say we maybe had, I'm going to guess there were 14 counselors, waterfront director, arts director. I'm going to say somewhere in the mid-20s we had back then in this for our summer program. And at the time it was slightly different because there was no day camp. And I think over the years the camp has grown with the day camp on the back property, on the range they called it. And so that's increased. And I think since then, I think there are four additional cabins since I was here back then. And so there's a few changes, and some of the cabins now are accessible, handicap accessible, so which is great. But back then I think we had, I'm trying to think in my head now, I think we had 10 cabins back then, or 12, no, it was 12 cabins back then. And there was a cluster here of 8 and 4, so yeah, there were 12 plus 2 LIT tents back then. And then we had the out trip program that I thought that's what the camp needed to expand, because we had no more room at the time to expand here on the site. So I really pushed for tripping programs. So back then we had 2-week tripping programs, 3-week tripping programs, and a 4-week tripping programs for wilderness LIT programs. So if there were staff interested in becoming more adventure-based programming, tripping-based programming, they would take the wilderness LIT program. And if you're more interested in becoming leaders at the camp and being counselors here, they would take our traditional LIT program, which was the 4-week program with only a 1-week end of camp experience in Algonquin Park.
What might have been some of the challenges you faced as executive director and summer camp director?
You know, when I first joined the camp, it was only a 2-month operation. So when I was first hired, I'll still remember the question. Herb Watson asked me the question. He was the treasurer of the board at the time. He was a Rotarian, and Herb was an interesting character, big rough, but he was actually quite a marshmallow inside when you got to know him. He said, "What's your vision for the camp?" And I said, kind of candidly, I said, "I can see this place operating year-round, 365 days of the year." And then it was Bernie Cahill who said, "Well, if that's the case, I think you're the guy, because we can't have this beautiful property sitting there only 2 months of the year being used and sitting for 10 months of the year." And so I hired teachers. The first round of teachers we hired to run the outdoor ed program was Paul Mathers, Ann Hollingsworth was hired, and soon after that I hired Jacob Rodenberg to teach. So those are the first 3 teachers. And then the other challenge I'm going to say back then is that we were unknown, like we were just getting ourselves going, so getting known in the community. So marketing played a big piece of it, trying to get out. And I remember visiting just about every retail stop in Peterborough saying, "Hi, I'm the new director at Camp Kawartha," giving them a brochure. And then I can't tell you how many visits I made to Toronto to visit with our families that had come that year to say, "Are you happy with the camp?" And we had these kind of Tupperware kind of parties where other families were invited. And so I spent the first few years on the road, traveling, visiting with families. And the best help that I received was a mentor of mine. He's now since passed, but Dr. Bruno Morowitz, who owned Camp Panaka, took me under his wing and really kind of educated me about families and building kind of legacy families and then second generational families. And he said you have to kind of visit them in the off season. You have to kind of really, they become part of your family. And so I took those words, his wise words, to heart, and I spent a lot of my time away from camp visiting families in the off season and really trying to secure their commitment to come back and their loyalty. And they basically brought other campers, and that's how we grew the camp over the years, from that loyalty.
Right.